ahead. But it's a good way to start the week, and I'm really pleased to have here the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, Dr. Najat Mahalamjid, who was an old acquaintance, actually, who was one of the first people that I met when I arrived here in New York in pre-COVID times. So it's nice to see you again here. And thank you also for being the mastermind of this event today, which is about the climate crisis, a threat multiplier for violence against children. And we're really honored to have also the Executive Director for UNODC online, Ms. Gada Wali, and Vice President for Democracy and Demography, Mrs. Dubranka Suica, who's connected online with us from Brussels. And we'll also have a video message from the African Union Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian and Social Affairs, Ms. Sesuma Minata Samate. And here, as panelists, we have my dear friend René Rudiez from the Deputy Permanent Representative of Chile to the United Nations. But we also have Paula Narvaez, UN Resident Coordinator to Fiji, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, Mr. Sanaka Kumara Samarasinya, and the coordinator of the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, Mr. Hani Mansurian. So quite a impressive panel to discuss an issue that, Majat, thanks to you, we become more aware of. I mean, one does think that, of course, climate does impact also of children, but I think the merit goes to this report that we have made available also here in the room that gives us some stunning figures. When you say that around 1 billion children are extremely high risk of being affected by the climate crisis, that's quite a stark reminder of the fact that children are the least responsible for the climate crisis, and yet they are most impacted by it. And so today's discussion is really about making us more aware of the fact that we should not leave children behind in our policies to address the climate crisis and in our measures to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. And that rather than fueling a generational divide and leaving them behind, we should really make them the protagonist of the response to this crisis. And there's also, of course, an educational dimension. I say this because at High Level Week, we had this Transforming Education Summit. So I think we should really try to factor in more in our discussions here, the role of education, and ensure that in schools, we do provide climate and energy and environment education for children to enhance what they already do, actually, because they already are playing an enormous role in reminding politicians of the importance of addressing these crises, but to strengthen even more their advocacy and agency role. So that's why it's also important that today we include in our discussion a youth representative, and I'm really looking forward to hearing also the reflections from Michelle, who's joining us from Kenya. But I'll stop here because my role is really just that of hosting this event, and we're really pleased to do so. And I hand over to you, Najat.
Thank you, dear Silvio, and it's nice to see you again. Excellencies, dear friends, I know that many persons are online, dear colleagues, dear Michelle, and dear participants. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today, online and offline. I am very grateful to Her Excellency Ambassador Mr. Silvio Gattuso, Deputy Permanent Representative of the European Union Delegation, and Mrs. Radal Wali, Director General of UNODC, as co-sponsors and partners in this crucial issue for children and for the entire society. My gratitude to all the panelists that I will name after for their interest and engagement, and above all to Michelle. Without active participation and the voice of children, we will never change the world. As I stressed in my presentation to the General Assembly on Friday, the climate crisis has become a threat multiplier of violence against children. My office issues today, as you highlighted, Silvio, an advocacy brief expanding the elements in the report to the GA and providing concrete information to inform policies and practices addressing the climate crisis to prevent and protect children from climate-related violence. The advocacy paper is in some USB key and it's disseminated in here. And you have also some on paper, and it will be disseminated with all key stakeholders, and states. Without further ado, I will give the floor for the welcoming remarks to my dear friend, Rada Al-Wali, the Executive Director of UNODC. You have the floor, dear Rada.
Thank you, dear Najat. I'm pleased to be with you. I'm very pleased to join all of you today, ladies and gentlemen, at this event addressing the climate crisis as a threat multiplier for violence against children. Today's children had no role in causing the climate crisis. From an early age, children understand the basic concept of fairness, but it's forcing them now to grow up in a world where they are more vulnerable to hardship, violence, and exploitation. It is not fair. They know it, and we know it. Climate change is leaving 1 billion children at extremely high risk, including hundreds of millions exposed to heat waves, cyclones, flooding, and other disasters. Displaced, forced to travel, unaccompanied, or pushed into poverty, many of the children affected by climate change are exposed to environments and situations where they are far more likely to face violence. And the consequences go beyond the immediate hardship caused by climate-related devastation. Climate change is creating a more volatile planet, and with it, more volatile societies that are more prone to abusive, exploitative, or violent behavior towards their children. Climate change could push up to 132 million people into extreme poverty by 2030, while extreme climate events continue to severely disrupt agricultural production and compromise food security and livelihoods around the world. Such difficult conditions create fertile ground for desperation and exploitation. Vulnerable children are forced to work, forced to marry, forced to endure rising levels of violence in their communities and in their homes. Those who live in the most affected countries and regions find themselves most vulnerable, even as climate change and its consequences further deepen inequalities across borders and within societies. As we approach the COP27 climate conference in November, the international community is working towards crucial steps to reduce emissions, protect ecosystems, and ensure a fair transition to a greener way of life to prevent and mitigate the future consequences of climate change. It is just as important to be ready to help the children who are suffering and will suffer horrific experiences as a result of the consequences that are already unfolding. To ensure that we can protect them, we need strong, effective, and compassionate justice systems. Criminal justice systems around the world, and especially in countries most affected by climate change, must have the capacities, resources, and conviction to bring perpetrators of violence against children to justice and hold them accountable, even in the midst of competing priorities. Justice systems must also be able to deal with children who come into contact with the law, to recognize victims and give them the help they deserve, and not to put them at greater risk of being victimized again by blindly applying punitive measures. We must prioritize child protection and put in place the laws, policies, and cooperation frameworks to enable its application. Through our global program to end violence against children, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is providing technical assistance to more than 50 member states in developing justice systems capable of responding to violence against children and in empowering children as agents of change to live free from violence. We are collaborating closely with SRSG, Najat, and her office to help countries mitigate child protection into their security, rule of law, and development efforts. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the SRSG's office and the European Union for co-organizing today's event and for their dedication to this important topic. We are committed to working with all of you and with children and young people to integrate the protection of children into the climate response. Ladies and gentlemen, If we want to protect children from violence, we need to talk to them, listen to them, and empower them to play the role in preserving their own future. Before I conclude, I would like to direct a few words to Michelle, our 14-year-old participant from Kenya, who is at this event today speaking for her generation. Dear Michelle, we are with you. We will not abandon you to an uncertain future. We will not surrender to a world where it's more common or acceptable for you to suffer violence. It is our responsibility and it is your right. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, dear Radha. And I know we are going to listen to a video from Her Excellency Mrs. Sesuma Minata Samate from the African Union Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian and Social Affairs. It's a video that was read, it's going to be read by the Honorable Sidikou Aïssatou Alassane Moulay, member of the African Child Rights Committee and Special Rapporteur on Child Participation. It is in French. I can summarize at the end if you want.
Should we do the vice president? Maybe we can. Yes.
Meanwhile, what I suggest is I will give the floor to Mrs. Dubravka Swika, the Vice President of the European Commission for Democracy and Demography. Dear Dubravka, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. Thank you, dear Najat. Thank you, dear Silvio, dear Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Michelle. I'm really happy to be able to participate in this important event. To you, Najat, I'm really grateful for your strong message during the EU Forum on the Rights of the Child, which took place at the end of September. Especially in the current context, the violence against children has steadily increased exponentially. Climate change is one of the key factors, and we must remain alert to the alarming figures. In this vein, I also welcome the UNICEF Children Climate Risk Index as a very useful evidence-based tool to document its impact on children's lives and rights. According to this index, 1 billion children worldwide are at extremely high risk from the impacts of climate change. Across the globe, almost 90% of children are currently exposed to air pollution, many even before they are born. This is likely to deteriorate unless there is a solid reduction in fossil fuel combustion. Over 1/3 of children globally are currently highly exposed to heat waves, water scarcity, or pollution, lead pollution. This is only the tip of the iceberg. Children are surely the least responsible for climate change, yet they bear the greatest burden of its impact. I would like to highlight some concrete examples. Climate change can be a direct cause of malnutrition. Environmental hazards and lack of access to water, sanitation, and hygiene can be deadly, especially for children under 5. Extreme meteorological events can destroy schools and disrupt education. Climate change can magnify gender inequality for women and girls. A recent study by UN Women has shown that their access to water, natural resources, and livelihoods are threatened. This always has an inordinate effect on women and girls. This evidence calls for concerted actions by us all. First and foremost, we need to recognize that children and young people are already actors of change. They are at the forefront of raising awareness on climate change, discrimination, and injustice. Therefore, and in pursuit of intergenerational fairness and justice, guiding principles both for the European Union and the United Nations We are strengthening our partnership with children and youth as we devise policies tailored to meet their needs and to protect their rights. This vision also underpins the Youth Action Plan in EU external actions, which we adopted last Tuesday. As part of the European Climate Pact, we are inviting young people to engage, for example, by becoming an ambassador or making a plan. By involving schools in climate, energy, and environment education, the Education for Climate Coalition will empower children to become agents of change in the implementation of the Climate Pact and the European Green Deal. Dear friends, dear participants, in her State of the Union speech on 14 September, President von der Leyen reiterated that it is essential to put young people's aspirations at the heart of everything we do. I'm quoting, every action that our union takes should be inspired by a simple principle, that we should do no harm to our children's future, that we should leave the world a better place for the next generation. End of quote. This highlights once again that in all our policies, children and young people must be in front and they must be front and center. During our recent EU Forum on Children's Rights, I was profoundly touched and impressed by the eloquent and frank interventions of the children. I quote Elizabeth and Charles. It was Elizabeth and Charlie. We are the present and we are our future. As we build more resilient democracies, we must remember that we will only be successful if we invest in the young generation now and fully include them in our policy making. This is also my pledge to you, dear Ms. Chair. Today's exchange is very important. Close synergies in our work at all levels with children and youth. They are essential to tackle the interrelated challenges of climate change and violence against children. I was recently, as you know, in New York for a series of meetings. I vividly remember the heartening mural in front of the United Nations headquarters, painted by a Brazilian street artist, a father handing the globe over to his young daughter. This embodies precisely what we are talking about today, our responsibility towards present and future generations. Thank you very much for listening and all the best.
Thank you, dear Dubravka. Can we have the video now? It's possible? Just to let you know, because the sound was not clear, all the speeches will be, available so you can hear them again. But you understand that it's a climate crisis and we need to invest on children. This is what to make it short and straight to the point.
Excellences, distingués participants, Mesdames et Messieurs, chères filles et garçons, tout protocole observé. Je souhaite la bienvenue à tous ceux qui participent à cet événement parallèle hybride sur le thème « La crise climatique, un multiplicateur de menaces pour la violence contre les enfants ». Je voudrais également remercier les organisateurs, à savoir les missions permanentes de l'Union européenne, le bureau du représentant spécial du secrétaire général chargé de la question de la violence contre les enfants et le bureau des Nations unies contre la drogue et le crime, d'avoir dédié cet événement parallèle à ce thème spécifique afin de sensibiliser aux risques accrus de violence contre les enfants à la lumière de la crise climatique actuelle et de plaider pour des réponses plus efficaces. Étant donné l'impact disproportionné du changement climatique sur les enfants, y compris son rôle dans l'augmentation de la vulnérabilité des enfants à la violence, aucun sujet n'est plus approprié ou urgent. Le changement climatique est une menace existentielle et un danger actuel pour les communautés, les écosystèmes et les économies de l'Afrique. Aujourd'hui, les enfants constituent environ 50% de la population africaine, ce qui signifie qu'ils continueront à subir les conséquences du changement climatique pendant au moins un demi-siècle d'ici à un âge avancé. Bien qu'elle contribue de 4% des émissions mondiales de gaz à effet de serre, l'Afrique est l'une des régions les plus vulnérables au changement et à la variabilité climatique. Les graves impacts du changement climatique sur l'Afrique devraient s'aggraver à moins que les émissions mondiales de carbone ne soient considérablement réduites et que l'adaptation au changement climatique ne soit considérablement renforcée. Le COVID-19 a exacerbé les effets du changement climatique sur le continent, réduisant la capacité d'adaptation des pays africains. Distingués participants, mesdames et messieurs, chères filles et garçons, en effet, la crise climatique a mis la vie et le développement des enfants en grand péril. La crise climatique a eu un impact négatif sur l'accès à l'éducation et aux soins de santé, tout en appauvrissant des millions de familles, ce qui, à son tour, exacerbe l'exposition des enfants à la violence, à l'exploitation et aux abus. La crise a entraîné des conflits et une déstabilisation dans de nombreux pays. Au cours de cette sombre situation, l'Union africaine a fait des efforts concrets pour faire face à l'impact du changement climatique. Parmi ceux-ci, elle a mis en place une stratégie qui fournit un cadre continental pour une action collective et une coopération renforcée dans la résolution des problèmes de changement climatique. La stratégie, entre autres, reconnaît que les femmes et les enfants et les personnes âgées sont particulièrement vulnérables. En outre, en 2021, la Commission de l'Union africaine a lancé un plan d'action continental quinquennal pour la relance verte 2021-2027. Compte tenu de la gravité et de l'urgence du problème, il est important que nous assumions également la responsabilité de rendre des comptes aux personnes touchées, y compris les enfants. Le changement climatique met en péril les gains de développement, la prospérité et les aspirations de l'agenda 2063 et de l'agenda 2040 de l'Afrique. Le changement climatique est en effet un formidable défi pour le potentiel d'annuler les gains durement acquis au fil des années sur divers fronts dans la réalisation des droits de l'enfant. Pour réussir nos efforts d'atténuation et d'adaptation, nous devons parler d'une seule voix et agir à l'unisson. Nous devons investir davantage et nous devons accorder la priorité aux plus vulnérables, y compris les enfants et les femmes, dans nos efforts d'atténuation et d'adaptation. Je vous remercie.
Thank you a lot. I just want to summarize, but very, very shortly, just the two main issues regarding Africa was one of the country most impacted and least responsible. And she reminds that 50% of the population are children under 18. And she reminds also that, Africa is facing many crises and it's a priority to invest in children because they are not currently, because they are young, but because also they are the future generation. And she was speaking about an impact that could last at least, 50 years more. So this emergent issue. And they are not going to meet the achievements and the goals of Agenda 2030, 2063. So we need to be more, to invest more, to cooperate more, to make sure that the most vulnerable, including children, are in, really at the heart of all the policies, even climate policies. And I love what she told, we need to be accountable to population and mostly to children. So this is the last intervention from the welcoming remark. I want to tell many thanks to Radalwali and Dubrovka Swivka, because I know that they have to leave. Many thanks, and we will share with you also all the video of all these events. If you allow me, before sharing the video message, I want to share with you key 3 messages. I will be short, I will try. First, the climate crisis, and we heard it, is a threat multiplier for violence against children. The nexus we called in the advocacy brief. Children, and we heard it a lot, who bear the least responsibility for the climate crisis are among those hit hardest by its impacts. And we heard it also, around 1 billion children are at extremely high risk of being affected by the climate crisis, including pollution, scarcity of water, drought, desertification, heat waves, floods, storms, food insecurity, and loss of biodiversity, fires, rising sea levels. More than 10 million children were displaced as a result of weather-related events last year, and it will increase. The climate crisis is magnifying children's exposure to violence and is exacerbating the vulnerability of children already impacted by existing and ongoing and long-lasting crises worldwide. Children, as you know, are especially vulnerable to all forms of violence, including trafficking, sexual exploitation, child marriage, and child labor, among others. And the most vulnerable children are particularly affected, including girls, children deprived of family care, with disabilities, living in poverty, in rural areas, in humanitarian settings, and those who rely on a close relationship with nature and its resources, such as indigenous children. Second, child-sensitive responses to climate change are needed now more than ever, and before the COP27. And as I highlighted in my discussion with children, I have observed, and I know many of you, a high level of climate anxiety and dissatisfaction with government, institution, and private sector responses. And I saw yesterday the tweet of Greta also telling that we are in the precipice, and so we had really to start thinking a little bit more about children and how they are living that. And what we saw is that despite various commitments and policies to resolution and so on, to tackle the climate crisis, the protection of children of their rights is not duly addressed. In addition to greater attention to children and their rights while addressing the climate crisis, there is a greater need for investment in adaptation and resilience. And cooperation and multilateralism need to be strengthened based on mutual partnership and accountability. Climate justice and social justice are needed more than ever. And the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment by the GA resolution, the last one, 76/300, provides really a sound roadmap for action to protect the most vulnerable, including children, and should not be parked but actively used. Third, children are and must be part of the solution. Children from all parts of the world are fighting back on the drivers of climate change and calling for urgent climate action despite the barriers they face. We need to listen, empower, and involve them more in decision-making processes to ensuring that climate policies are child-sensitive. Even some countries are not really very happy with, but we have to push. Dear participants, in the advocacy brief, we highlight numerous positive initiatives and efforts at global, regional, and national level addressing the core drivers of violence related to climate crisis. But more importantly, we highlight the initiative from children and amplify their call for urgent, healthy, safe environments free from violence for all children independently of their status, as stressed by over 100 of children I met last week. Our promise to children to put an end to violence by 2030 is regrettably very, very far away from being reached. Too many children are really left behind. Climate crisis is a child rights crisis, and children need to be at the center of all our efforts, including the discussion regarding the future generation. I would like to repeat today what I stressed in the room of the United Nations in this interactive dialogue that was not very interactive. We need to stop talking, we need to act So all of us, let's join the children's call. And now it's my pleasure to share with you a number of video messages and challenges at stake from children and young people, which I very much hope will inspire and challenge all of us today. I hope it's going to work.
My name is Omar Hamed, a 17-year-old child from Kenya.
My name is Fatma Ali and I'm 16 years old. I'm from Pakistan.
My name is Aniva. I am 16 and I am a climate activist from Samoa.
My name is Elian Hassan Gadai. I am from Kenya. I'm 12 years old.
You are the big chief of the world. What is the action? What are you going to do?
I'm going to try and stop the climate crisis. When I try and stop it, children should be able to decide how to stop it in a way that won't hurt them.
Hay muchos niños y niñas que viven cerca de nosotros, que tiran mucho humo negro. Las llaman zona de sacrificio.
Climate change has caused a lot of issues, and one of the biggest ones is poverty, which leads to young girls being given into early marriages in order to provide livestock and money to provide for the younger siblings or the family itself.
My message to the world leaders is that children are extremely vulnerable to the floods in Pakistan. They are either victims or at risk of displacement, waterborne diseases, trafficking, abuse, and other forms of danger.
Pacific Islands are experiencing climate change at extreme levels, temperature increase being visible in bleached coral, and sea level rise being extremely prevalent, causing land loss and erosion.
शहर में हम लोग जैसे जो रास्ते में या फिर बस्ती में जो हम लोग रहते हैं, आजकल हम लोगों का सांस लेना भी मुश्किल हो चुका है. जो गाड़ी से जो धुआं निकलता है या फिर जो फैक्ट्रीज है और इंडस्ट्रीज से जो केमिकल निकलता है, उससे हम लोगों का दम घुटने लगा है.
We are facing the devastating effect of preventable occurrences such as sea level rise that are taking away opportunities and rights of many, especially the underprivileged children. As a part of the Children's Advisory Team to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, along with international NGOs and experts, we are developing the General Comment Number 26. This is an international guide to 196 countries on ways governments can uphold children's rights impacted by climate change. We believe that we can still alleviate the situation only with everyone's involvement.
Pakistan contributes less than 1% of global carbon emissions, yet this country and its children pay one of the harshest prices for this climate crisis. As a child environment activist, I am helping children access mental health support for when they're traumatized by such disasters.
Climate change can really affect children, such as mostly affecting girls. When drought happens in like a county like Kajada County, there's no rainfall and livestock end up dying and they have no vegetation or anything to eat. And so they find a girl in the village to sell off to a man above age, and she's underage. And she has to go through FGM, which is basically her being cut. And it's really painful for her. So then they sell her off, and it's kind of unfair because she doesn't want it to happen.
Help us to get more instances, more places in which we can participate, in which girls can have their voice heard.
Do everything in your power to not forget, as an example, the indigenous children. Try to incorporate as many perspectives as possible from as many children as you can.
Help can the SDG reach the grassroots level, and how can we children actively participate to ensure that there is progress?
Fighting for children's rights without children is not fighting for their rights.
Will you help me in this mission?
No need to and it will introduce very well the panel. So I will invite Her Excellency DPR René Ruiz Diaz of Chile, and please have a seat close to me. Mr. Sanaka Kumara Samarasinha, UN Resident Coordinator to Fiji, Solomon Island, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, and Mr. Hani Mansourian, coordinator of the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. And online, we have Michelle that you already saw in the video. She is a 14-year-old girl from Kenya and child environment activist who have some questions for you as panelists. Michelle, are you on board?
Yeah, I am. I hope you can hear me.
We hear you, but we don't see you.
I hope you can see me now. Hi everybody. My name is Michelle. I am 14 years old from Kenya. I am a trained journalist and a child environmental activist. I also run a project whereby we supply basic needs such as food, water, and sanitary towels to children in the slums, especially girls. They also have discussions where the girls can sit down and have a talk and just open up to the issues that they have. Before we start, I would like to thank the UN for giving me this opportunity to represent all the children around the world, and also for involving me involving children in your activities. So now I'd like to present a set of questions that the panelists will answer. So we have a question from Chile. We know that climate change is one main priority for your government. How does this translate into actions for children? The next question is from the UN Resident Coordinator, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. The Pacific region is most prone to be affected by climate change. What measures have you taken to adjust and to protect children from the impact of climate crisis? Another question from Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. We know children in humanitarian situations related to climate change are the most vulnerable. How does the humanitarian response ensure children are protected from violence at the outset? So now I'd like to hand it over to Najat and her panel discussion to answer these questions.
Thank you, Michelle. Dear Renee, you have the floor.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Well, good morning to everyone. We are part of the mission of Chile to the UN. We are very pleased to participate today in this discussion. Thank you, Najat. Thank you to the UNDC and to the EU for inviting Chile to this discussion. Was very happy to see two Chilean girls in the video, so we are very involved in that. The thing is that, climate change and the rights of the children are very important for Chile and for the current government as well. So, we received with a lot of interest this invitation. I will address the question, will make general references. Chile adopted a national determined contribution, very ambitious, in order to, with the goal of absolute emission reduction of 16% by 2030. But what is the challenge that we see with our fight in climate change? That you need to differentiate the different impacts on the different constituencies, let's say, like the case of children and adolescents, which are the most vulnerable. So you need to implement and to devise a specific response to achieve what is increasingly, understood that climate justice. This is not one size fits all, definitely. The rights of children and adolescents require specific actions for their special protection. For Chile, it is important to recognize that the negative impact of pollution, desertification, loss of biodiversity, affect climate justice because it affects how children live in their environments, where they grow up, where this affects how they develop safely, and their personality, sometimes with very lasting consequences. If I have time, I would refer in another time, at the specific case of was mentioned there, the Song of Sacrifice in Quintero, Puchuncaví, which happened around 2018-19, which have prompted the intervention of the Ombudsman of the Children. And when we first got the invitation here, we thought perhaps we don't have so much to share. But by preparing to this event, we discovered that we have something to share, and we would like to hear from others, what is their experience. But definitely we see that this is a work in progress, to raise awareness of how children are affected. So going to specific measures, we have taken some legislative measures recently. In March this year, we adopted the law 21/430 on guarantees and comprehensive protection of the rights of children and adolescents, which recognize the right of children and adolescents to live in a healthy and sustainable environment. And it assumes the obligation to promote training, information, awareness programs for the responsible and sustainable use of natural resources and the acquisition of positive habits for the conservation of environment and the mitigation by the children, by the adults, by the whole society. Another piece of legislation which has marked a progress in Chile recently was the adoption of the Escazú Agreement just in last May, who guarantees the right of access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental matters, which allow progress in the involvement of boys and girls in environmental and climate decision-making processes. Last June as well, so you can see this is very recent, I'm talking about the last 5 months, more or less. Last June, the Climate Change Framework Law was adopted, establishing the goal that the country be carbon neutral and climate resilient by 2050. It also seeks to reduce greenhouse emissions that cause climate change. Additional measures in terms of education, we are providing children with climate education for their adaptation and preparation to the effects of climate change. Also, we are promoting the development of support material for the parents and the teachers to be able to address the concerns of girls and boys, including from an emotional perspective. And of course, the inclusion of all actors is key to really fight climate action. So we have promoted the participation of young people in the COP, for instance, to support the transformation that so urgently we need. And well, in another point, if I have the opportunity, I would like to refer to the case of Puchuncaví that really shows how the institutions little are addressing the issue and finding the ways, and they draw a lot of inspiration and guidance from international instruments. This is very interesting. So this is happening in Chile. This is for that now.
Thank you so much. I know that Chile is a champion regarding child participation. I followed how it was during the constitution. That unfortunately was not adopted for the moment, but I hope it will happen. And I will be very happy also after making the interactive discussion to provide us, information regarding what happened in Cali, because I think that local responses are good, but we will see it. Dear Sanaka, Pacific Island that I will visit in beginning December. Sorry. But you hear me?
No.
Sorry. And now I give the floor to Sanaka from Pacific Islands that I will visit in beginning December, I think so, if the things are going well.
I know, especially if things are not going well. That's precisely why we need to do that. No, thank you, first of all, Najat and Pablo, for inviting me here. It's rather serendipitous. I'm a little bit of a pretender. I wasn't supposed to be here, but now I am here. But I am, first of all, the disclaimer is that I am not a Pacific Islander. So I'm not going to say I'm speaking on behalf of Pacific Islanders, but I am an island. I come from Sri Lanka. And I'm not a tribe anymore, clearly. So when you asked me to say a few words, I wanted to be sure that I didn't just talk to the UNICEF representative. I asked my daughter, who's 12 years old, what she wanted me to say. So I'm just going to tell you what she said. She said, and thank you very much for the question, because I think it goes to what she said as well. She said, giving us voice is not just listening, it's hearing and acting and telling us what you did because of what I said. And so she wants me to tell her what happened here. So Agus, please take notes, okay? So I'm going to report back to my 12-year-old. And I think that's fundamentally it, Nasha, because, and you mentioned this earlier, I think, this sense of accountability. And I don't think we're there yet. So what are we doing in the Pacific? Let me just quickly paint a little bit of a picture of what it is in the Pacific we're talking about, right? I support 3 out of the top 5 most disaster-prone countries in the world. I support 3 of them. Countries like Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tokelau, they're all in the Pacific, and there's one other, the Maldives, all 5 meters or less in terms of the highest point of elevation, right? So essentially going underwater. You're talking about some countries like Nauru, it's 100% urban, on top of course, all the other issues that they have. Went from the highest per capita income in the world to almost, I'm not saying it is, but almost a failed state at one point, and it's now picking itself back up. We're talking about countries that are thousands and thousands of kilometers apart, but trying to function as a region. Really, really, really tough part of the world to live in. But of course, it has its own beauty, right? And I think one of the challenges for us is, first of all, understanding the region better, because those of us who are not from the region, we look at it and we say, oh, the Pacific is homogeneous. All Pacific Islanders are the same. They're not. And within the countries, climate change affects different people differently. I think the Secretary General once said, so, and I'm paraphrasing, he said something about, you know, you think we're all in the same boat, but some people are in cruise liners and others are hanging on to lifeboats, right? So climate change doesn't impact all of us around the world the same. The Pacific Islands feel it every day. And then within those countries, there are people who feel it even more so than others. And children, and then amongst children, there are particular children who feel it even worse. Children who don't have both parents, children with disabilities. And these are not, the disaggregation is not reflected anywhere. So one real challenge is data. And so one of the things that we're trying to do as the UN is to ensure that there is disaggregated data and analysis following the collection of data. Because we know there is a big problem with climate change. We know anecdotally that children suffer, but we don't have the data and we don't have the analysis. So that's one. 2, what we're trying to do is to ensure that there is a comprehensive response. Now, there are 29 UN agencies working in the Pacific, and I'm supposed to herd the cats as a resident coordinator. Not an easy job. Never mind all the other development partners. And these countries are very small. So you take Tuvalu, is a country of 10,000 people. And when we go to them, we go 29 different times. This is the UN. So we said we were going to change that. And one of the key things we did was recently, for example, the EU ambassador and I and the Australian High Commission, New Zealand High Commissioner, we all went to Vanuatu together. And we went to the communities together, and we sat and listened to the children. They did, had skits and so on. But we said, okay, we've got to address this together. One of the challenges that we have around the world, and I'm sure you would speak to this, is the different way in which we respond to development needs and humanitarian needs. And it's partly to do with funding, right? So we have humanitarian funding over here, development funding over there, and the two never meet. But in the Pacific, Monday is humanitarian, Tuesday is development, Wednesday is humanitarian again. And every 2 years, countries like Tonga have 20-30% of their GDP wiped out. So is it humanitarian? Is it development? So we said, no, we really have to change the way we do this business here. So it's not just UNICEF that needs to deal with it. It's also UN Women. It's also UNESCO. It's UNDP, looking at their networks, their Access to Justice project, the UNODC's work with the police. So using the data, using the analysis, we say we've got to have a comprehensive response. And it needs to be country by country, and then we bring together the synergies between countries, so it's either sub-regional or multi-country, or where it makes sense, regional. Third, we said we've got to move away from just saying we're doing projects. We have to look at policies, we've got to look at legislation, we've got to then look at joint programs, and then we've got to ensure that we monitor effectively together. And finally, we've got to look at budgets, because all of this, ultimately remains with what? Us, and talking about ODA, for instance. If you take just a disability, for instance, Najat, there are approximately 6% of the Pacific population that live with disabilities. And in terms of budgeting, disability is budgeted at 0.01%. So you can imagine, but take the infrastructure project, take the environmental project, take the social services project, and say, how does this actually change the lives of children, and especially those children who are most vulnerable? So these are some of the things that we're trying to do. Not yet there, so that's what we need to do in the Pacific.
No, I have to come very quickly.
Very soon.
Thank you very much, Najat, for inviting me and kind of bringing the voice of the humanitarian actors into this very important conversation. And Hujambu, Michelle, thanks for the question that you asked, Your Excellencies, dear participants and panel members. I will talk primarily about how all of this relates to humanitarian, because as you suggested, after almost 2 decades in working in humanitarian sector, I have a lot of memories of children who have been impacted directly by humanitarian crises that are all indirectly related to climate engraved in my brain. I have memories of the 9-year-old Christine from Davao City who was unaccompanied because of the Pablo hurricane back in 2012, I believe, and was holding on to a teddy bear, which was the only thing she could rescue from what basically she held dear. 13-year-old Dieudonné in outskirts of Bogo in Burkina Faso, who was kneeling next to a dying calf, which was the only possession that he had, but the calf could not survive the diseases that come from Mali. The calf was dying and it was all drought related. The calf was dying because of diseases that they were not used to. Or the 15-year-old Fatima from Aleppo, Syria, which many would argue is at the heart a climate-related crisis, who had an infant on her lap and was talking about how she was forced to marry her cousin who belonged to an armed group for protection reasons. So she and the family were protected. All of these are related to the climate crisis, directly or indirectly. The problem is easy to grasp. Climate change contributes to more conflict and disasters. Conflict and disasters themselves lead to increased vulnerability and risk for children, and increased frequency and incidence of violence against children. And consequently, children's well-being and healthy development is jeopardized. And that leads to this cycle of violence and poverty. which becomes very difficult to break, as we all know. Unfortunately, the number of conflicts and disasters are increasing year by year. At least 1 in 4 children are currently living in conflict and disaster-related areas, and that number is only increasing. Climate-related disasters are having a direct effect on migration, displacement, conflict, loss of livelihood, food insecurity, psychosocial distress, and much more, which in turn increases the risk of an incidence of many different, often extreme forms of violence. To make matters worse, risk and vulnerabilities are already elevated in conflict and humanitarian settings that gets added to by the climate crisis itself. The good news is children are resilient. However, the compounding impact of recurring instability and continued poverty erodes their ability to bounce back. What we talk about, resilience. Families and communities, which are at the forefront and they're the backbones of the protective environment for children, also lose their ability to care for their children the more these disasters reoccur. Somalia, which is at the brink of a famine now, has its worst drought, and Somalia almost every year has a drought. It has its worst drought in 40 years, and the impact on children and families are harrowing. Now, coming back to your question, Michelle, humanitarian actors do have solutions, things that have worked in the past, and we know what to do. It's not always easy, but it's possible. The solutions that I would highlight here are all linked to the strategy of the Alliance, which was developed in consultation with many children and many humanitarian actors around the world. Solution number 1 is placing children under protection at the heart of all humanitarian action. There's much more that we can do in terms of promoting children's voices, prioritize their needs, and encourage their leadership in helping themselves, their families, and communities. In Southeast Asia, more than 30,000 children were surveyed by IFRC and the CPAR as part of as part of a campaign that was called "We Need to Do Better," and all of them, majority of them, expressed active interest in being part of the solution themselves. Solution number 2, working across sectors. We need to consider children's needs in a holistic manner. We cannot continue in our silos of health, education, nutrition, and child protection. There are good examples of how these sectors have worked together, but we have a long way to go to break down these silos. Solution number 3, as local as possible and as international as necessary. Communities have the solutions themselves. We need to listen to them. We need to create this space that belongs to them. And a lot of international organizations are now occupying that space. We need to free that space so they can do what they do best, which is protect their children. And last but not least, prevent harm before it occurs. A lot of humanitarian actors are programmed to respond. Something happens, the child is separated, we respond to it. But we need to step back and make sure that we are preventing. We know that violence and many other forms of harm to children are preventable, at least for the most part. The key is in identifying risks and protective factors and addressing them at large scale in these contexts. Prevention is not only cost effective, but an ethical imperative. We need to invest in forecast and early warning information to pre-finance for pre-finance mechanisms and anticipatory action so that we can prevent a lot of these harms. I would like to close with a quote from a book that was written in 1895 that says, "To rescue the fallen is good, but it's best to prevent other people from falling. Better to put a strong fence around the top of the cliff than an ambulance down in the valley."
Thank you. Thank you, Annie. Thank you really for the three of you for your frankness and also to really tackle the issues. I will come back to Michelle because I have many questions for you also. Michelle, are you happy with the responses? Please feel free to interact, to react. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Would be, we truly need to take specific measures to fight against climate change. It's not enough to have policies and laws in place. We need to also have practical steps, and I challenge to work towards that. So thank you.
I start child rights activism since I was young, very young, and it was very long time ago. And I am always hearing the same comments. We need data to act. So my question, why we have not data since many years? Right? I have a big problem. It made me crazy. Many agencies are on the board, many persons, many things, and no data. So this is a big question for me. So this is one. The other things I heard about many policies, many legislations. The problem is implementing and accessing, to justice, to this. The word that made me currently more and more crazy, as that we are repeating since I was very young, is child-centered, cross-sectoral, comprehensive approach. So, and here is how we translate it. And I think we need also to criticize ourselves as UN system and also as NGO, international NGOs, to be more and more, as she highlighted, Michelle, to be more practical. What we mean, it's a chain of services. This is very important, where we can have them. The other thing is really what you were telling about humanitarian development and security and now climate, and you have many crises and we are always reacting. I was visiting many countries and I never saw so many flags and so many logos, in all these refugee camps. And at the same time, children are dying. So something is going wrong. And I think we need to have a strong self-accountability. What we are doing is not good. To be very frank, this is really something that, and we need to assess the impact of our work. The other thing is also about UN, and we have the UN framework, and you highlighted it very well. And I think we need also to have a kind of criticism regarding also the UN system to stop becoming delivery services, but to never forget that we are more people-centered and to work, in a coordinated approach and not in competitivity. And the last but not the least, what I loved, this community, and you told it regarding what is happening in the, I don't remember the CAVI, that we need communities have the response. We need to empower local NGOs, local communities, and so on. So I think, very frankly, all these things we know. So what we need, a tsunami, personal tsunami to react, because it made me having many concerns, because this is a question that were asked by Michelle. So you will respond to that. In addition, I open the Q&A. Alexander, Mem, I don't see the Mema. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the floor. Good afternoon, everybody. And my question is for the question. I'm Alexander Mema. I work with Danish Refugee Council as a team leader, protection education in Democratic Republic of Congo, Nord-Kivu province. My two questions are, what does UNICEF plan to do in order to ensure that this climate crisis, which is a threat multiplier for violence against children, is an opportunity for these children? And also, has UNICEF and other child protection stakeholders already, I think, about a plan which would turn the threat into an opportunity? There are my two questions I want to ask to the panelists and other stakeholders. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Alexander. Who is following? Because I have no idea. Frédéric?
Thank you very much. I have the following question. As many of our banks and pension funds are fueling the climate crisis through investing into gas and oil, is it possible for all the actors who care about children to have a quick checkup with their banks and ensure that their own funding is not fueling the climate crisis, as the children themselves have absolutely no influence on that. And it's kind of cruel to continue financing fossil fuel expansion.
Thank you. Thank you, Frédéric. I don't see Christian.
Cassian first.
Sorry, Cassian was first. Cassian?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go.
Thank you very much. So my question to you is, do you have any plan to evacuate children suffering in Libya, struggling there in Libya in kind of human trafficking? Do you have any plan to evacuate them and to protect them into education and the psychosocial service to become really children? This is my first question. Second question, did you have my first question?
Yes.
My second question is, during the COVID-19, many children and their parents were losing their life because of lack of protection of United Nations, because everything was locked down. So now, who is going to get involved for those children lost their life because of lack of protection? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cassian. Kristen?
Thank you so much. And thank you to the speakers and also to Michelle. My question is also bouncing on back on what Hani was describing, as so many children that many of us who've been working in humanitarian contexts have encountered over the years, who are really bearing the brunt and at the forefront of climate degradation. And so my question is, how can we, balance the importance of the protection of those who are most vulnerable alongside the imperative to also afford opportunities for participation, meaningful participation as well. Today, actually, Talism and other partners as well are launching a resource that is supporting practitioners in a rights-based and resilience approach to this. But I'm really keen to hear from panelists in your context about how to achieve this balance between protection and participation. Thank you very much.
No more? So I suggest that you start responding. Sanaka.
Thank you, Najat, for putting me on seat there. But let me not just only speak for UNICEF, but for the UN system as a whole. I think that's really important because that's part of, in fact, the challenge, because UNICEF has the C in UNICEF, and everybody thinks that therefore it's only UNICEF's problem, right? And I think UNICEF itself sees that as their duty, and that creates a problem because if you say, oh, children are my business, by default, you're kind of saying to others, children are not your business. And I think we need to move away from that. So that's a conversation that we are having locally, saying, children are everybody's business. And so one of the things, for example, we're emphasizing is the intergenerational aspect of violence, right? Because we found, for example, there was a lot of work being done and needed to be done in the Pacific on ending violence against women and girls. But what about the boys? So the boys are kind of being left out during all these programs and these policies and plans. But of course, the boys end up being men. And of course, they end up also being the perpetrators. They're victims at one point, and then they're perpetrators. So sort of understanding that children are the business of everybody is the beginning, I believe. And it's one of the things we're trying out in the Pacific. The second thing is, I think, going to Hani's point about prevention and in the context of climate change, preparedness. This is a real problem. Najat, you know it well enough. It's not that there's a lack of will on the part of the UN system. We'd like to do it, but unfortunately, we are at the mercy of how we're funded. And if the funding comes for very specific things, like post-disaster response rather than preparedness or prevention, then that's what we're going to end up doing. Now, of course, we can be creative because, as I said, disaster preparedness and response is so closely connected in terms of time and space in the Pacific. But we really need to address the funding issue and make sure that it's not just humanitarian and humanitarian in the context of response, but also development and preparedness. I think we need to think more creatively about adaptation, about resilience in the context of ensuring children and services that are targeted to children are adapted and are resilient. So just some thoughts from my side, some things that we're trying out. But ultimately, the question you ask is, and it boggles my mind, the smallest countries are the ones that have the least amount of data. How is that possible? You take a Nauru is 10,000 people, and you say, well, you know, in a week, I would probably go to every household, you know, myself. But the smallest countries have the least amount of data, in my experience. Now, why don't we fix it? And I think part of it is because we don't really care collectively. If we did, we would have done it. And why don't we care? Because we're not being held accountable. Why? Because those who are disempowered cannot, by default, hold us accountable. And children, especially the most vulnerable children, are not in a position of power. So last thing I wanted to say is, you know, and we're trying this out. You talk, one of the questions about human rights-based approach, and I used to be a human rights lawyer, and I'm trying to include, we are trying to include this in our programming going forward, to say, okay, this is really about measuring empowerment. It is not about, did we build a seawall? It's not about, did we have a more resilient hospital? It is, what difference did it make in the lives of a person? So if you take a child with disabilities in Tuvalu, in Funafuti, in Tuvalu, because the UN had a cooperation framework for 5 years, so what difference did it make in that child's life? And did we take that child from this level of empowerment to that level of empowerment? It's really difficult to do. And we need to make sure that that child is actually able to ask us, hey, what difference did your program of $50 million make in my life in Funafuti, Tuvalu?
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much. Well, I can agree with all that has been said. Actually, you know, I think we share this vision when facing this global problem. You know, and the emphasis on action and urgency, of course, is indispensable. You know, because this is happening in the Pacific. This is vital for those countries and the population, for sure. Well, being aware of a problem is the first step, and I think this is why it is important your report, you know, that connects the issues of climate change and violence against children as drivers of multipliers of threat, and also the UNICEF index, you know, of child-focused risk assessment, you know, they are connecting the two issues. So this is very important. This is what also the legal framework in Chile is doing, because all these laws I cited before about guarantees for children, etc. You know, they include the right to a healthy and clean environment, and the children, and they have been made also with consulting the children. You know, have been the surveys and polls, and they manifest these are their concerns: the right to water, to the clean environment, to food, all these kind of things which are affected by climate change. I think these studies are important. Now talking about practice, well, institutions are important and can make progress. This is what happened in Chile in this area, sacrificed area sadly called like that, you know, in Puchuncaví, Quintero, where 19 entities, private and public, were operating with very serious episodes of contamination. That, as I said, was around 2018-19. Then the just created ombudsman for children, she said, I need to do something about this also. So she conducted a report, you know, a very serious report with the university, etc., trying to understand what happened, the affectation to the children, etc. And it confirmed that 17 of the rights of the convention were being violated, but it was a very sound report. Later, what she said, how can I solve this thing or to stop this from happening, to addressing the pollution? She filed a petition and action to the Supreme Court, which came with a very sound judgment of saying, this is happening and this needs to stop, and order, public sector, especially, to take action to stop that. Now the challenge is about implementing those recommendations of the Supreme Court judgment. This is a process that takes time and needs resources to redirect the activities, whatever, but things are happening. Of course, we agree with the children, we need to do more, because what she saw in the report is that the actual way of life, have the right to go to play with other kids, or to attend the school, because the classes were interrupted due to the heavy contamination, was deeply affected. So these really leave consequences on the people and need to be addressed. So we are working on that way, but of course, much more needs to be done. I hope that this responds a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Najat, and the panelists, and also the questions that came in. Maybe starting with your question about data, at least in my world, it's really interesting of this kind of seeing data in action as the two ends of the spectrum. Sometimes you hear, we need data before we can act, when there are needs in front of you and you actually have to act, but people want to wait for data. And then you have the other extreme of, oh, there's so much to do that we don't have time for data. So this kind of dichotomizing it is part of the problem. I don't know if that will solve the problem. But also, Najat, to your point about there is something wrong if you haven't been able to resolve a lot of these issues. It reminds me actually that one of the people who asked questions is from DRC. I lived in the DRC for a few years, and it was one of those environments where I felt that we have this little capacity to build, and there's these massive bulldozers going in front of us and just destroying. The amount of destruction that is happening and violence and conflict that is taking place just does not match the ability of any humanitarian agency to be able to respond to it. So the kind of scale is just a different scale. And now you add climate change, which is again a massive scale disaster. I honestly don't know how we are going to do it, but there is something wrong with the way we are conducting business. And I feel like a lot of it has to do with the crisis of greed in the world. So there's much deeper issues that we need to address if we want to solve this fundamentally. Just to echo the issue of funding, we really struggle with humanitarian funds in the sense that they're all short-term, they all should have this short-term view of the problem, where majority of conflicts in the world are beyond 10 years old. So how do you call that a short-term crisis, right? The question about Libya, I can't speak to the issue of evacuating children, because that's not necessarily always a good solution, because you don't necessarily want to remove children from their own environments, but you need to address the issues that are causing the problems that the colleague was highlighting. Libya is really all right. Okay, but it is. I mean, Libya, I feel like, is one of those failures of the international community. So we're all to blame for it to a certain extent. COVID-related protection issues, we all have been shouting for 2-3 years about how COVID has exacerbated, and it's going to continue exacerbating poverty and livelihood issues that are at the root of a lot of the problems. The solution, again, is going back to the basics and addressing the inequalities in the world, in addition to responding to the needs of children. I'll speak to the issue of that Christine asked about balancing participation of children and protection. Again, I think it's a problem of dichotomizing those two. People talk about it. We either have to protect children or they can participate. If they participate, we can't protect them. But they can go hand in hand. The problem is that kind of seeing it as two dichotomous issues. And I will finish by the issue of accountability, which colleagues brought up. I'm a deep believer that we live in an adultist society, a society that values the views of just the 20-year-olds to the 60, 70, 80-year-olds because they're in the productive age and they have the voice, they vote, they have the power. Their voices are valued. Those above 80 and those below 20, we don't really care about it. And we need to do something fundamental to change that narrative, because a lot of what we do in terms of participation of children is still very symbolic. It's tokenistic. It doesn't really mean that we're listening to them. So including your daughter's observation that it's not just listening, it's actually acting. So I'll end on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I will, there is one question, and after we have to close because I have to follow. I don't see the name here. Dr. Abla. دكتور عبلة دكتور عبلة البدري لك الكلمة.
أهلا بيكم. Can you speak in Arabic or English?
We don't hear you.
Which is better, to speak in Arabic or English?
English, if you want them to understand you. You can do it bilaterally. Go ahead in English, Abla.
Okay, thank you for all your presentation. I just want to make one comment that we need to know your plan to protect the children in the alternative care institutions or families, because they are very vulnerable, and with the climate change problems, I think they will be more violent. More vulnerable. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well. It's about children in institutionalization and the institutionalized children. So I can, yes, go ahead.
And foster families. Foster families as well.
Okay. I will react very quickly if you allow me to this. Institutionalization of children, is everywhere. And currently, not only the climate crisis, but also the war and the displacement in many countries are pushing. Also, many countries, I was in Romania, I was currently working on alternative to institutionalization, Poland, and with the war in Ukraine, the institutions are opened again. So we have the big problems that for, policymakers, it's more easy to build walls than to put children behind, because it's the best way in their mind. And it's the same for children on streets, and we have more and more children on streets also worldwide. So it's not the good solution. And we know the alternative to institutionalization. We know also that we need to invest on foster families. And we know also that in institution, you have many children who are not orphans. They are here because of socioeconomic problem. And we come back also to the prevention and to the protective and risk factors, because if you are supporting families and really providing education and making these children having access to school and to living the good living condition, it will be wonderful. The other thing that you have is disabled children or children with disability that are put in institution instead of making school and all services accessible to these children. And in addition, worldwide and in many countries, you have in many European countries and other countries, you have migrants who are currently also institutionalized. And here it's because they are deprived of liberty. And just I want to let you know that as sharing the UN Task Force on Children Deprived of Liberty, it's one of my main tasks, but it will take time, to be very frank with you, because we need, and because you are coming from an Arabic country, and I am coming from an Arabic country, we have this caritative approach, building more and more institutions, and it's more easier than really having foster families and working with them. But it's just to let you know that it's a priority. Sorry, we cannot answer to all the questions if I am not wrong, and I will give the floor again to Michelle for her closing remarks, and I am sure that they will be wonderful, and you have really to make us more reactive and to challenge us. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much once Thank you so much once again, panelists and participants. First of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Najat, for setting aside time to share with children her report to the General Assembly. It was truly a great time. I would also like to thank the UN for giving me this opportunity to be able to be part of this meeting and represent children, especially girls around the world. I hope from the conversations you have picked action points that you are going to act upon to protect children from the negative effects of climate change. Unlike most parts of the world, the impact of climate change is felt at the household level in Africa, having a direct impact to the children. Children, especially the young ones, live their lives at a faster pace than adults. Consequently, anything harmful to have a relatively greater impact on them. Climate change fuels violence against children. It affects their right to life, their right to health, and their right to education. We need you to take action towards protecting us, and as you do so, kindly keep engaging us. Involve us in policy making, involve us in implementation as well of policies and programs addressing climate change. As we say, climate crisis is a child crisis. Thank you everyone. Let's now go and do better.
Wonderful, frank, and constructive, panelists. Big clap